The Hatsuharu-class destroyers were a class of Imperial Japanese Navy destroyers in the service before and during World War II. The final two vessels in the class, completed after modifications to the design, are sometimes considered a separate Ariake class. Background: in compliance with the 1930 London Naval Treaty, the Hatsuharu-class vessels were significantly smaller than the previous Fubuki and Akatsuki-class destroyers. However, Japanese naval designers attempted to stretch contemporary destroyer design to the limit and beyond by equipping the new class with an armament only slightly weaker than that carried by the earlier classes. Despite its smaller hull in displacement, this resulted in a top-heavy design with severe stability problems, and the weight control measures used by designers to fit as much armament as possible onto a ship of a given tonnage were carried to an extreme, which further contributed to the structural weaknesses of the ships of this period. This was graphically demonstrated when the torpedo boat Tomazuru capsized in 1934 during heavy seas and when a typhoon ripped the bows off two Fubuki-class destroyers in 1935. As a result of these two incidents, the Hatsuharu-class vessels had to be rebuilt or modified while building to remedy the stability problems. Design: the Hatsuharu-class destroyers were designed to accompany the Japanese main striking force and to conduct both day and night torpedo attacks against the United States Navy as it advanced across the Pacific Ocean. According to Japan's naval strategic projections, they were to be armed much as the Fubuki class despite displacing only 1,400 tons compared to the 1,700 tons of the earlier destroyers. Furthermore, the fire control systems were to be more modern than the older systems and suitable for anti-aircraft use. This required the gun turrets to be modified for high-angle fire, which also meant more powerful motors to traverse and elevate the guns more quickly to engage high-speed aircraft. The torpedo launchers were to be given a protective shield to allow for use in heavy weather and to protect against splinter damage, and the Hatsuharu vessels were to be fitted with modern, enclosed command spaces protected against strafing aircraft. These requirements could only be met by adding weight high up on the ship and increase the ship's center of gravity. The only way to adhere to the allotted displacement was to try to reduce the weight of the hull and other equipment below the waterline as much as possible. But this put the ship's designers in a no-win situation, as any reduction of weight below the waterline further raised the ship's center of gravity and reduced her stability. The weight of the hull could generally be reduced by using higher grades of steel that were lighter and smaller for the same strength, reducing dimensions, particularly length, or using advanced construction techniques like welding that saved weight over the conventional riveting. The Japanese used the same high-tensile steel for the Hatsuharu class as they did for the older destroyers and chose not to increase the power of the turbines and boilers to achieve the desired high speed, but lengthened the hull to offset the reduced power of the lightweight machinery. The beam was increased to counter some of the extra top weight, but the draft was reduced to reduce hull resistance, which also reduced stability by lessening the area of the hull beneath the waterline in comparison to the area above it, which was subject to pressure from the wind. Electric welding was extensively used to reduce weight, although it was at an early stage of development in Japan and was still problematic. Extensive weight-saving measures were used during the design and construction of the hull. More frames of light construction were spaced more closely together to reduce the thickness of the hull plating, and the extensive use use of welding were some of the techniques utilized to reduce hull weight by 66.5 tons in comparison to the Fubuki class. The Hatsuharu vessels were some 10 meters shorter than the Fubuki class vessels, but weighed 4.9 tons per 1 meter of hull length compared to the latter's 5.09 tons per 1 meter. Description: the Hatsuharu-class ships were shorter than the predecessors, at 109.5 meters overall. The ships had a beam of 10 meters and at full load a draft of 3.35 meters. Despite the emphasis on weight saving during construction, the ships were significantly overweight as completed and displaced 1,530 metric tons at standard load, and 1,981 metric tons at full load, nearly 130 metric tons more than planned. The hull of the Hatsuharu-class vessels retained the general configuration of the Fubuki-class destroyers, with a long forecastle and a pronounced flare of the forecastle to improve seakeeping at high speeds by adding buoyancy and reducing the spray and water coming over the deck. A large bridge structure was located at the aft end of the forecastle deck, topped by 4 fire control stations of various types. Lowest, just above the compass bridge, was the torpedo director, with the gunnery fire direction station next above. The fire director tower was third from the bottom, and behind it was the 3 meters rangefinder. Each of these was protected by 10 mm plates of decal steel against strafing and shell splinters. For the first time in a Japanese destroyer, a super-firing turret was fitted forward of the bridge. It was only a single-gun Model A turret, to save weight high in the ship, and was mounted on a deckhouse to elevate it above the twin-gun Model B Mod 2 turret mounted on the forecastle deck. The second twin-gun turret was mounted at the rear of the ship on the main deck. These turrets were slightly heavier than the earlier Model A and Model B turrets fitted on the Fubukis. All turrets were fitted with the 12.7 cm Type 3 gun. The uptakes of the 2 forward boiler rooms were trunked together after the break in the forecastle into the fore-funnel, while the rear boiler room exhausted into the smaller rear funnel. Both funnels were inclined to the rear to reduce the amount of smoke that might reach the bridge. A tripod mast was fitted between the bridge and the fore-funnel. Between the 2 funnels was the forward 61 cm triple torpedo tube mount fitted on a low platform. Behind it was a torpedo locker with its mechanical quick reload system for the 3 reserve torpedoes inside. To preserve lateral stability, the aft funnel was offset to starboard while the torpedo mount was offset to port. The reload locker was also offset slightly to port and angled inboard to facilitate reloading. The middle torpedo mount was positioned behind the aft funnel on the centerline, but its reload locker was positioned identically to that of the forward mount. Superimposed to starboard and overlapping the middle mount was the rear triple torpedo mount positioned on the rear deckhouse. Immediately behind the mount was its locker positioned on the centerline, but angled slightly to the right so that its mount only had to traverse slightly to align with the locker and begin reloading. This was the first ship in history to be fitted with superimposed torpedo tubes, made necessarily by the designer's insistence on fitting 9 torpedo tubes despite the Navy's requirement for only 6. A small platform that carried a 2 meters rangefinder was mounted above the rear torpedo locker, and a 90 cm searchlight was mounted on a tower behind the rear funnel. The 2 license-built Vickers 40mm anti-aircraft guns were mounted on an elevated platform at the front of the rear funnel. Curiously, they were another case where the designer exceeded the requirements laid down by the Navy. Propulsion: the Hatsuharu-class carried 2 sets of cam-on-geared steam turbines, 1 for each shaft. Each set consisted 1 low-pressure and 1 high-pressure turbine, plus a cruise turbine connected to the high-pressure turbine. The LP and HP turbines were connected to the propeller shaft by a two-pinion reduction gear. Each propeller had a diameter of 3.05 meters and a pitch of 3.7 meters. The total horsepower of the Hatsuharu-class was only 42,000 shp compared to the 50,000 shp of the Fubuki-class predecessors, but the machinery was significantly lighter and more powerful on a unit basis. The Hatsuharu's machinery weighed only 106 tons compared to the 144 tons of the Fubuki class, or 396 shaft horsepower per ton versus 347 shaft horsepower per ton for the older ships. Similarly, the three Kampon-type Rogo boilers used in the Hatsuharu-class ships weighed 50 tons in comparison to the 51 tons boilers used in the Fubuki class, but produced 14,000 shp each, while the older boilers produced 12,500 horsepower. This gave a ratio of 3.6 kilograms per shaft horsepower for the Hatsuharus compared to the 4.1 kilograms per shaft horsepower of the predecessors. The newer design of boilers initially used steam pressurized at 20 bar, just like the older models, but used superheating to improve efficiency, while the older boilers simply used saturated steam. A single 100 kilowatts turbo generator was fitted behind the reduction gears in a separate compartment, and two 40 kilowatts diesel generators were located between the propeller shafts. As initially completed, the Hatsuharu had a range of 4,000 nautical miles at a speed of 18 knots with 460 tons of fuel. On trials, Nenoi had a top speed of 37.64 knots from 47,150 shp at a displacement of 1,677 tons. Armament. The Hatsuharu-class destroyers used the same 50 caliber 12.7 cm gun as the Fubuki class, but all turrets could elevate to 75 degrees to give the main guns a minimal ability to engage aircraft. During the war, the single turret was removed on all surviving ships after 1942. The only anti-aircraft guns were two water-cooled, license-built Vickers 40mm guns. These guns were deemed to be too heavy, slow-firing and short-ranged, and were replaced by license-built French Hotchkiss 25mm Type 96 anti-aircraft guns in single, double and triple mounts from 1943 for the surviving ships. Exact numbers are not always known, but Hatsuharu was carrying three triple-powered driven mounts, including one mounted in lieu of the single 12.7 cm gun turret, one twin-power driven mount fitted on a platform in front of the bridge, and two hand-worked single mounts in June 1944. These powered mounts were unsatisfactory because their traverse and elevation speeds were too slow to engage high-speed aircraft, and more single mounts were fitted to ships in the last year of the war. For example, Hatsushima mounted 10 single 25 guns when she was lost in July 1945. Four license-built Hotchkiss 13.2mm Type 93 machine guns were also fitted to Hatsushima, but these were of limited utility against modern aircraft. The 61 cm Type 90 torpedo was mounted in triple-tube Type 90 Model 2 launches, derived from the twin-tube Type 89 launcher used in the Takao-class heavy cruisers. Shields were fitted to both the torpedo mounts and lockers to protect them from the weather and from strafing aircraft. Initially, the shields were made from duralumin to save weight, but these quickly corroded and had to be replaced. Nicmo steel, taken from the air chambers of obsolete torpedoes, 3 mm in thickness, was chosen for the new shields to save weight. The Type 90 Model 2 weighed, including the shield, a total of 14.4 tons excluding the torpedo itself. Despite the addition of an extra torpedo tube, it was still lighter than the 14.5 tons of the Type 89. It was traversed by an electro-hydraulic system and could traverse 360 degrees in 25 seconds. If the backup manual system was used, the time required increased to 2 minutes. Each tube could be reloaded in 23 seconds using the endless wire and winch provided. Only 18 depth charges were initially carried in a rack at the stern, but this increased to 36 after the autumn of 1942. Apparently no sonar hydrophones were fitted until after the outbreak of the war, when the Type 93 sonar and Type 93 hydrophones were mounted. Both of these were inferior to contemporary American and British designs. Radar was not installed on the surviving ships of this class until late in the war, possibly as late as 1944. They were given a Type 22 radar on the foremast, a Type 13 on the mainmast, and a Type P-27 radar countermeasures device was carried high on the foremast. Construction. A dozen Hatsuharu-class destroyers were authorized in 1931 as part of the so-called Circle 1 program. 3 were laid down in fiscal year 1931 and the next 3 in fiscal year 1933. The remaining 6 ships were built as the Shiratsuyu-class. Design modifications. On trials, the Hatsuharu was found to roll heavily, with a very short period of roll and shield at an angle of 38 degrees at high speed when her helm was set to 10 degrees. This demonstrated to the Navy that her metacentric height was too low. The Navy ordered in September 1933 that 30 centimeters bulges be fitted on each side to increase her beam and thus raise the metacentric height. Hatsuharu and Nenoi were modified after completion. Wakaba and Hatsushima were modified during construction. Ariake and Yu-Gi-Oh were at a much earlier stage of construction and had the beam increased by 1 meter. The bulges were estimated to add 30 tons to the trial displacement. The capsizing of the torpedo boat Tomazero in 1934 forced the Navy to re-evaluate the heavy armament of the Hatsuharu and other classes. As a result of the investigations in ship stability after the capsizing of the torpedo boat Tomazero, all vessels in the Hatsuharu class were modified to improve their stability. The afterdeck house and rangefinder were removed and the forward single 12.7 cm gun mounting was relocated to this position, directly ahead of the after twin gun mount. Its magazine was converted for use as a fuel tank. The No. 3 triple torpedo mount and its reload locker were removed. The compass bridge was lowered by 1 level and the anti-strafing armor was removed from the entire bridge structure. Both funnels were shortened by 1 to 1.5 meters, as were both masts. The forward torpedo tube mount was lowered 30 centimeters, the machine gun platform by 1.5 meters and the searchlight platform by 2 meters. The bulges were removed and the anchor chain stowage was lowered by 1 deck. The outer bottom plating was reinforced and about 70 tons of ballast was added in the ship's bottom. An automatic system was fitted which filled part of the fuel tanks with seawater to compensate for the consumption of fuel and resulting rise in the center of gravity and hence loss of stability. When the seawater was added to the fuel tank due to the different specific gravities, the seawater sank to the bottom of the tank, while the oil floated on on top. The first two ships of the class, Hatsuharu and Nanoe, had already entered by the time of the Tomozero incident. They were removed from service and modified in the Kure Naval Arsenal. The remaining four members of the class were still under construction and were modified before completion, based on the stability issues shown by Hatsuharu during her trials. Ariake and Yu-Gi-Oh had been modified for two balanced rudders placed directly behind the propellers and angled outward 18.5 degrees to reduce the angle of heel when turning. These proved to reduce the speed by 1 knot and were removed after the trials as superfluous since both ships had been rebuilt to reflect the lessons of the Tomozero incident. Reinforcement of the hull. As a result of hull damage sustained by two Fubuki-class destroyers during a typhoon on 26 September 1935, the subsequent investigation led to all ships in the Hatsuharu-class spending 3 months in the shipyards having the hulls strengthened, at the cost of an extra 54 tons of weight, and the fixed ballast increased from 64 to 84 tons. As a result of these and previous modifications, the ships were 23.2% heavier, had lost 33% of the torpedo armament and were 3 knots slower compared with their original design values. Wartime service. All Hatsuharu-class ships were lost during the Pacific War. 4 were sunk by aircraft attack, and Nanoe was sunk by the American submarine US Triton. Hatsushima, the last Japanese destroyer lost in the war, struck a mine on 30 July 1945.